Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Heather Grant. I am one of the community admins here at the Maintenance Community Slack. Thank you so much for joining today. If you're not already a member of the Maintenance Community Slack group, we would love to have you join us. The link, I believe, is already in the chat. So just go ahead and click through there. And you'll be taken through the process accordingly. Today we have Eric joining us. Eric is the managing director of Road to Reliability, a startup company on a mission to create reliable plants around the world. Eric trains and coaches maintenance and reliability professionals to build skills across their professions and industries, and he supports companies in shifting and improving their maintenance strategies. He is also available in our maintenance community Slack as an expert in there. So again, please feel free to join. The recording from today's session and all of the slides you see here today will be available tomorrow for viewing. If there is anyone else who you know who would benefit from hearing some of Eric's expertise, please feel free to forward it on over to them. One final piece of housekeeping before I turn it over to you, Eric. We have just Eric's and mine video and volume on today. So for all of you attendees out there, you will just ask questions through the chat button. So hover over where you see the presentation as well as my face, a little chat bar will pop up at the bottom of your screen where you can send through answers to Eric's questions or questions for Eric in the chat there. We will have about 10 minutes at the end, 15 maybe for some questions. So please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation. And we will be sure to answer them towards the end. Thank you again for joining. That's just about all from me. I'll turn it over to you, Eric, to take us through sustainable maintenance cost reductions.
All right, thank you for the introduction, Heather, and good morning to everyone on the call. Well, I say good morning, but I guess actually for most of you, it's good afternoon. It's Friday morning here. All right, so in this webinar, I'm going to share with you 4 steps to sustainable maintenance cost reduction. It's probably going to take me about 20-30 minutes to work through the slides, so we should have plenty of time for questions and a bit of discussion at the end. Now, before we delve in, let me share a little bit about myself. You probably don't know me yet. So my name is Eric Capier. I grew up in the Netherlands, which explains the funny accent. For the last 23 years or so, I used to work for Shell and ConocoPhillips, worked around the world, initially in the Netherlands, the UK, Philippines, Oman, which is in the Middle East. And then since 2013, I'm based in Australia. And during my career, I've worked on a range of different assets, old assets, new assets. I've worked on billion-dollar greenfield projects, onshore, offshore, oil, gas, and unconventionals. I've managed small maintenance teams with quite small budgets, but also relatively large teams with very substantial maintenance budgets, really. And my career kind of really started to take a turn back in 2018 when I started the Road to Reliability website. And it was something that I started largely out of, well, let's be honest, frustration with what the industry was offering as solutions. As a customer, I found when I reached out to providers that many of the solutions on offer were overly complex in my view, and they often ignored some of the fundamental basics of good maintenance and good reliability practices. And rarely was enough attention paid to kind of educating and building capability in organizations. And yeah, my view is that that's where it all has to start. So I developed Road to Reliability and ran it for a couple of years as a side business. And then last year I went full time. So I now focus exclusively on online training and coaching, and I do some consulting on the side. But enough said about me. Let's get on topic. So maintenance costs, and maintenance costs are once again under pressure. And let's be honest, they're pretty much always under pressure, right? If you've ever managed a maintenance budget, you will have always been under pressure to reduce that budget. But in the current economic climate with the global pandemic, the pressure is really on. And apart from the very tragic impact on people's health and lives, many lives we've lost, there's also been a very big economic impact. Many jobs have been lost. We'll all know of people who've been impacted. And most countries, if not all, are experiencing pretty harsh economic downturns. The Bank of England actually has declared that the UK has not seen an economic downturn like this for, I think, close to 300 years. 300 years. I mean, that's the last downturn like this was somewhere in the 1700s. So pretty incredible. A bit closer to home here in Australia, it was announced last year that Australia is officially in recession, which was the first time in 29 years. So we all know the environment we're in. We all know we have to reduce our costs. And so when costs have to come down, budgets have to be cut. And in asset intensive industries, the maintenance budget is often one of the biggest ones, right? 20 to 30% of the total annual budget is often spent on maintenance. So you can guess whose budget is going to get slashed, right? That's the maintenance managers. Now, there's little we can do about the business environment we're in or the need to cut the costs. I mean, we have to maintain our businesses and have to keep them alive. What we can do something about, though, is how we cut our costs. And we've all seen the classic approach and probably been victim of it to some degree, which is, you just slice 20% or 30% of the budget. You defer a whole bunch of work, you send people home, and job done. And look, most plans can limp along like that for 2, 3, maybe even 4 years before the lack of maintenance starts to impact the equipment, eventually haunt the organization in a way. And by then it's often a new plant manager, a new maintenance manager who has to deal with the consequences with the outfall. So what I'm proposing today is that we don't do it this way. We don't just ruthlessly cut, but we adopt a more structured, more disciplined, and more sustainable approach to reducing maintenance costs. Now, to be clear, what I'm going to share is a framework only. It's something that you're going to have to adopt to your business, to your organization. But it's simple, it's effective, it's 4 steps, and it really does work. But before I'm going to go into the details, there's one thing that's really important that I really want to kind of make clear. It's probably the most important thing you take away from this session is that maintenance costs should be seen as a consequence. They are a consequence of the amount of preventive maintenance we do. They are a consequence of the amount of equipment failures we experience. They are a consequence of the amount of people we have working for us, whether that's employees or contractors. And they're a consequence of how efficient we are in executing the work we do. And they are a consequence of what we pay for the parts and materials and services that we buy. So maintenance costs, are a consequence of how we set up our maintenance and how we run our maintenance. And that is a really important key concept to take away from this session. And when you think about it, when it comes to how you spend your money, how you spend your maintenance budget, in basic terms, you spend your money on 3 things, right? It's labor, whether that, again, be your own employees or contractors. You're going to spend a sizable chunk of your budget on parts and materials and consumables and tools. And likely you'll spend a good chunk of money on external services, whether that be contractors that work in the plant, specialist services, or OEM field reps. So if you want to bring down your maintenance costs, the what you need to do is actually pretty straightforward, right? You need to do less work. You need to be more productive. You need to use less materials, and you need to purchase less services. So the what is really quite obvious. The problem is, how do you do this? How do we do less work, use less materials, use less external services, and pay less for what we buy and still achieve a good maintenance performance and high reliability? And chances are that most of you are thinking, okay, well, this is all very nice, but that's just plain impossible. It's not going to happen. And I understand that it can feel that way, that it can look that way. But if you look around any major industrial plant, and if you look carefully at what maintenance is done and how that work is done, you're going to quickly see huge amounts of waste, really significant amount of waste. And interestingly enough, what you find typically is that that waste is almost always in the same areas. So when it comes to reducing maintenance costs, there are typically 4 areas that you need to tackle. And which is what I showed here. These are 4 things you need to focus on when you want to reduce your maintenance costs. Now, in the next couple of slides, I'm going to walk through each of these 4 key elements in a bit more detail. And then we're going to talk later in the presentation about what you can do to actually drive costs down using these kind of 4 levers. So first of all, what you really want to do is address your preventive maintenance program. In most industrial sites, the PM program hasn't been optimized, hasn't been reviewed for a very long time, if ever. And what you typically find when you walk in and start looking is that it's very wasteful, with a lot of tasks that just add no value, a lot of tasks that are done too often, a lot of tasks that aim to prevent failure modes that in the end actually don't really matter so much to the operation. You'll find that a lot of tasks are poorly defined, and so they're not done properly, and the tasks are not effective. You're in essence wasting your time and effort doing them. And you'll typically find there's a substantial amount of tasks missing, and tasks like these could sometimes prevent some of your main recurring breakdowns. And from experience and from studies and literature, it all shows it again and again and again that probably somewhere between 40 to 60% of PMs in a preventive maintenance program add very little value. 40 to 60% of PMs add very little value. So these tasks that you're doing are wasting your scarce resources, and they're essentially inflating your maintenance budget for nothing, for no good reason. So if your preventive maintenance program hasn't really been reviewed in recent years, like would be the case for many industrial plants, that is one of the key areas you need to tackle. And from my experience, I would say that if you do that and you do it well, chances are you can reduce your workload by a good 20%, maybe more. And so when you take 20% of the work away, you immediately reduce your costs. And not just costs for this year or next year, but these are costs that go away forever. And the second area that you need to look at is low maintenance productivity. Now, at almost all industrial sites, the average day of a maintenance technician is really just full of waste. You know, look at your maintenance technicians, how they spend their day, and your chances are you'll see them big time today looking for parts or tools, waiting for permits, waiting for instructions, waiting for equipment to become available. And then in the end, there's just way too little time left to actually do productive maintenance work. And this is typically all the result of not having a structured, disciplined planning and scheduling process in place, or the process may be in place, but it's just not adhered to, it wasn't implemented effectively and not sustained. And so typically, a plant runs with a wrench time of about 30%, which means that out of, say, 10 hours, you're only getting 3 hours of productive maintenance time. If you put in place an effective planning and scheduling process, you should be able to increase that to at least 45%. And if you go from 30% to 45%, that's a productivity increase of 35% without hiring anybody. So even if you don't already have planners and schedulers in place, you can move your team from 30% to 45% and increase productivity, get 35% more work done than you do at the moment. So that's a huge lever that you have and that you need to use to improve your performance and reduce your efficiency and lower your costs ultimately. Now, the third area you want to tackle is excessive or repeat equipment failures. It is very, very common to find maintenance teams doing the same repairs again and again and again and again. I mean, I see it all the times when I speak to customers who have repeat failures of equipment types that you'd think that shouldn't fail that often, that should last longer. And the problem is that the culture has become focused on what I call forever fixing instead of fixing forever. So we just keep doing the same repairs over and over and over rather than eliminating the defect that is causing those issues. And look, breakdown maintenance is a very expensive way to run a business. It's time consuming, it's demoralizing, and it drives an organization into a very reactive maintenance culture. And when you start looking, you typically find that it's only 5 or 10 pieces of equipment or systems that are accounting for the vast majority of your breakdowns of your corrective maintenance. So if you can target those and eliminate them, you can probably reduce your corrective maintenance costs by at least 20% or more. Now, the last big lever that you can tackle are your maintenance contracts. So you're going to have to look at the rates you've negotiated, because it's quite common that companies specify requirements to service providers and contractors that are higher than the standards of what they really needed. And that's wasteful. That drives unnecessary cost. But you also need to look at how you've structured your contracts. You know, very often contracts and agreements have no incentivization in place, and the goals between the two companies are actually really misaligned. So what you want to do is you want to look at how you can motivate your contractors and service providers to deliver you a high quality service, but at a lower cost. Now, of course, you do need to keep an eye and keep real about quality, because you can quickly lose everything you've gained when you start getting quality issues. But the bottom line is really that you need to work with your contractors and your service providers to, again, eliminate the waste, whether that is in the way they work or what you're asking them to do or to work to. Eliminate that waste, and the rates and costs will come down. And I would say is you should be quite easily gaining a 5% cost reduction by engaging with your key contractors and working through some of those things. So that's, in short, a framework of 4 steps that you can use to reduce your maintenance costs in a variable, very sustainable manner. And when you work through this framework, step by step, take your time and do it well, you're going to find that what you initially considered to be impossible actually becomes quite possible. And the secret here is, it's not really a secret, but the secret in a way is that you need to understand where your waste is. You need to tackle that waste, you need to eliminate it, and your costs are going to come down, and they're going to stay down. Right? So instead of just cutting things away, what you need to do is you need to take the waste away. And then those costs are going to come down and stay down. And that's where the sustainability comes from. Now, in my last role in the corporate role, I was the maintenance reliability manager for an LNG plant. The annual budget varied between $60 to $90 million, depending on the number of gas turbine overhauls we would do in a year. For that role, I developed a sizable cost reduction program. And it was based on these very same principles, which was you improve your maintenance productivity, get more work done with the resources you have internally, and reduce the number of external resources you bring in by eliminating non-value adding PMs. So take away all the work that actually doesn't need doing, that doesn't really add to the bottom line, it doesn't improve your reliability, it doesn't reduce your risks. And by eliminating the bad actors, the equipment that keeps failing on you, that keeps causing you a headache in terms of corrective maintenance and costs. And then negotiating better contracts and better rates. You see, because I developed this for a sizable budget, but it doesn't really matter whether you have a big budget or a small budget. The principles really remain the same. You need to eliminate the waste that's in the way you work and the work you're actually putting out there. So focus on doing the right things and doing them well. And then you need to keep in mind that your maintenance costs are a consequence. They are a consequence of the work you've set out there to be done and how well you do it. Now, I normally recommend that you execute these 4 steps in the sequence you see here, which is step 1, you start with improving productivity. And the reason I start there normally is because once you do that, it gives you more capacity, right? Once you get 35% more work done, that gives you capacity to get other improvements done. It levels the work out, it creates stability in your work environment, and it gives you more time to tackle steps 2, 3, and 4. Now, unfortunately, in this presentation, I can't really go through the real details of how you do each of these 4 steps with a big plan. But what I'll do in the next couple of slides is talk through at high level kind of what you need to be doing and what you should be looking at. So normally step 1 is that you start with focusing and improving your maintenance productivity. And as I said earlier, your typical wrench time is sitting around 30%. And with proper planning and scheduling, you're going to increase this to 45%. That's going to give you a 35% increase in productivity, which is the equivalent of expanding your workforce by 1/3, but you're not hiring anyone. You're simply getting more work done. And that then translates into a cost reduction because you can basically reduce your external services. Now, when it comes to implementing maintenance planning and scheduling, there's actually very limited investment required. So as a project, it has a fantastic return on investment, has a great ROI. And that's really good news when you're trying to sell it to your leadership. And on my website, I actually have a very neat little tool. It's called a wrench time calculator, and it lets you estimate how much value you can gain, your organization can gain from implementing maintenance planning and scheduling. And I'll make sure that there's a link to that in the slides here or in the Slack community, so you can all go and have a look. And I recommend you do it because it gives you a dollar value of what you can gain from doing this step. Now, I always recommend that you adopt a standard approach to planning and scheduling. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. Every planning and scheduling process out there goes through pretty much the same steps. So just pick a rock solid process, a proven process, and then use a proven framework for implementation. Because you see, that's where most companies go wrong. It's in the implementation. The improvements are often not sustained. And what I like to say is that when it comes to implementing maintenance planning and scheduling, you need to consider it as a change management project. And that means that to be successful, you obviously need to understand maintenance planning and scheduling, no doubt about that. But you also need to apply basic project management, and you need to really introduce some sound change management principles. And it's especially the change management principles, I mean, where most people go wrong. Often it gets ignored. And then the result is that the implementation doesn't really stick, the changes don't really last, and the improvements are just never realized or not sustained. So the key to success here is to use a proven framework for implementation and make sure you apply some basic change management principles. When you do that, you get that right, and you really can get that 35% increase in your workforce for almost no investment. Right, so step 2 was around eliminating your non-value adding PMs. And as we said, probably about half of the PMs in the typical PM program serve no real purpose. They are wasting your scarce resources. They are inflating your maintenance budget, and you're not really gaining anything from them. So what you need to do is you need to get rid of them. And the way you do that is really quite simple. You go into your CMS and you do a simple analysis of your preventive maintenance program that's in that system. You're going to generate some basic Pareto charts that are going to show you the PMs that cost you the most money on an annualized basis, and the PMs that cost you the most labor on an annualized basis. It's really quite a simple analysis. It's something you should be able to do quite quickly. You can do it yourself. You're not going to need an expensive consultant, and it's going to be very, very insightful. Now, once you have those Pareto charts, get a small team together, look at them, and focus on the priorities. And then start tackling the PMs. And then for each PM, look at the failure mode it's supposed to address. And then ask yourself a couple of key questions. Questions like, is the failure mode actually credible? I mean, have we experienced it? And is the consequence of the failure actually significant enough, important enough, that it would justify doing the work we're doing at the frequency we're doing it? And really important, is the task actually effective in dealing with the failure mode? Or are we doing something to give ourselves a sense of security, a sense of safety that actually is just false because the task is not really effective? So you need to work through a series of questions like these. And then when you do, you can find and you can eliminate the tasks that don't add value. Now, because you're doing this based on the Pareto chart that you developed, you're tackling the ones that are giving you the biggest benefit, the biggest bang for your buck. So it's a very efficient, very easy way to do a review of your PM program. You don't need to go do big studies, big RCM analysis to make a big dent in your PM program. You know, get those Pareto charts done and start analyzing your failure modes and seeing whether what you're doing is effective and value adding. Now, you do need to make sure that the PMs you're leaving in place or that you're improving are aligned to some fundamental basic reliability practices. I mean, it happens a lot that you see companies use time-based replacements for failure modes that are random with a constant probability of failure over time. That doesn't work. So you're wasting your time and resources. And so you need to avoid these kind of simple mistakes. And the way to do that is that you need to make sure that the people, that your people who are doing this work understand these basic principles. You need to educate them. You need to get them trained and get them to understand the key principles of a modern maintenance and reliability program. And then you can do this work yourself. And you can make a substantial reduction in your workload. All right, so step 3 was to eliminate your bad actors. You know, the few pieces of equipment in your plant that are responsible for the majority of your breakdowns, the majority of your corrective maintenance spend, the majority of your corrective maintenance workload. And the way you do that is, once again, by delving into your CMS and by analyzing your corrective maintenance history. Now, in the previous step, we were looking at our PMs. Now we're essentially looking at our CMs, our corrective maintenance workload, our corrective maintenance history. And once again, you're going to develop a simple set of Pareto charts that are going to show you the worst performing equipment or systems in terms of your corrective maintenance cost and your corrective maintenance effort and maybe failure frequency. And then when you do this, you usually find that you're going to have a handful of equipment that is behind most of your pain in this area. So then get together with operations, get together with engineering, prioritize which of these systems or pieces of equipment you want to tackle first, and then you're going to do some basic root cause analysis, and you're going to tackle all the underlying and contributing causes. Now, it's really important that you don't fall into the common trap of staying at the superficial level. It's so often that you read an RCA and the causes are operator error or the maintenance tech didn't do the work properly. That's likely not the root cause. What you really want to do when you get into this is to get down to the process issues, to the system issues, and fix those. And when you do, you'll find that you can make a really sizable dent in your corrective maintenance workload. And you can typically take a good 10, 20% off your corrective maintenance budget. And once again, that's off forever. It's not just a once-off cut, that is a sustainable cost reduction. And the fourth step we talked about was the need to look at your contracts and your rates. And as we touched on, you find that many organizations actually specify requirements that they don't really need, but that do drive up the prices on the supplier side. So what you want to be doing is go through the specifications and requirements internally that you've put in your contracts, but then also sit down with your suppliers and your service providers to really understand what drives costs at their end. And then you need to sit down together and see what you can reduce or what you can eliminate. And there are very often good win-wins possible in this space. You know, opportunities where you can reduce your cost and your supplier can actually increase profitability. That's a win-win, and that's going to give you a really sustainable cost reduction. And secondly, one thing you want to look at is you want to look at how you've structured your contracts, because what you want to do is you want to set them up in such a way that you incentivize your contractors and service providers to eliminate waste, to become more efficient, to become more cost effective, and thereby helping you reduce your costs. Now, often when I say this, I get quite a bit of pushback. And my answer is, well, just go out there and ask. Because what I find is when you approach your key service providers and contractors, the ones that really matter to your business, right? The big ones, and you ask for their help and their input, I often find that most of them are very willing to support you on that journey. Because look, good suppliers, they understand the value of a long-term partnership. They understand that if they do this well, they can be a long-term partner and supplier to your business. And that's value for them. Now, if you find that some of your key suppliers, that they don't want to play ball, that they're not really interested in helping you, well, that's a telling message. And you may well need to take some action and look at eventually retendering and finding yourself suppliers and contractors who do want to play ball and help you improve your business. And one thing I want to say here is that a lot of the previous steps that we talked about, the first 3 steps, really are steps you do largely between operations and maintenance. So you're going to have a fairly sizable workload on your plate. And this is an area where you can, in fact, this is an area where you should bring in your procurement and your contracts team. And you want to be able to take some pressure off your maintenance and reliability teams and reach out to your colleagues and get them to help you with this, because this is what they do when they can bring a lot of knowledge and expertise, but also horsepower to the table. So I realize that was quite short and quick, but we don't have time to get into the real nitty-gritty of these 4 steps. But hopefully that will give you insight in kind of the 4 steps you need to go through to make a sustainable reduction in your maintenance cost. Now, we started off this session talking about the fact that the pressure on maintenance costs has been increasing. And so the question then is, well, what do you do if you're in a real hurry? Because for sure, this takes some time. This is not something you can get through in a couple of months. So what do you do if you're under real pressure? How do you reduce your maintenance costs then? Well, unfortunately, you're still going to have to do the same work. There's no way around that. If you want to sustainably reduce your costs, then this is the work you need to do. But if you need to be quicker about it, if you really are under pressure, then you may want to change the sequence. So in that case, I would probably start off with a very focused effort on your PMs and really eliminate all the work that really doesn't need doing. So in the space of 1 or 2 months, you can probably eliminate 10 or 20% of your workload. Maybe a bit less, maybe a bit more. But that's a big chunk of work that you can take out, and that's going to immediately start saving money. Next, I would probably look at engaging your biggest contractors, the ones where you have the main spend, and reach out and see if you can renegotiate rates. In some cases, that may mean that you have to give in on some of your standards and specifications. So that takes careful consideration, but reaching out to your key suppliers can be a quick win. And it never hurts to ask. Because like I said before, it's so often that organizations specify requirements that don't really drive value at their end, but they do add the costs on the supplier end. So just go out, ask those suppliers, what can we do? What would drop our costs? And that conversation is very often quite eye-opening. So once you've initiated that work, and the key word there is initiated. If you're in a hurry, you need to initiate this and not just wait till you finish it. Once you've initiated it, start looking at your bad actors from a breakdown perspective, from a corrective maintenance perspective. And then at the end, only at the end do you tackle your maintenance productivity. And that's because this typically takes the most time, because you need to make a change in the way you work. You're not doing a once-off exercise. You're basically implementing a sustainable change. And I would normally say it takes 12, 18 months to really get a sustainable change in place that gives you the productivity increase that you're looking for. But that said, if the pressure is really on and you have the leadership support and you have a strong case for change and you have motivated and capable personnel, you can actually get through the implementation of maintenance planning and scheduling much quicker. You probably can break the back of it within 6 months and really start seeing big benefits within those 6 months. But just make sure that what you do is still done in a sustainable manner. What you don't want to do is rush it in 6 months and then a year or later, it all falls apart. Now, the last comment I want to make here is that if you really are under pressure, you need to work these improvements in parallel, not in sequence. But you also got to keep in mind that any organization can only absorb a certain amount of change at a time, right? And as a team, as a maintenance and reliability team, there's only so much work you can do at a time. There's only so many priorities that you can have. So you do need to be selective, and you may have to sequence these to some degree. But by reshuffling them in this order, you can get through the work and make the cost reductions faster than in the normal sequence. That said, I think in a normal sequence, it becomes much easier to handle because you actually improve your productivity. That gives you the capacity to do more work, and then you can get after your PMs, your bad actors, and your contracts. So I would always try and go through the previous sequence if you can, but if you're really under pressure this year, then consider doing it in this sequence. Now, it's all gone a little bit faster than I anticipated, but that's okay. It leaves us plenty of time for questions. before I kind of sign off, the one thing I do want to say, or I leave you with actually, is a quote from Bill Gates. And it's really relevant to everything we've just been talking about. And Bill Gates basically said that we tend to overestimate what we can do in 1 year and underestimate what we can do in 10. And that applies especially, really especially when it comes to reducing maintenance costs. You'll be amazed by how far you can bring your costs down and still maintain or even improve maintenance performance and reliability. All right, so thank you. That was a little bit shorter than I expected, which leaves us plenty of time for questions. So I'll hand it back to Heather and stop sharing my screen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was super insightful and really, really helpful. I always appreciate when there's, kind of chunks of information and like step by step exactly what you can do rather than just speaking super high level. I think you did a wonderful job sharing kind of very specific action items and procedures to follow for people here today. I know that there was just a couple of questions in the chat here. If there are any more from the audience now, please feel free to continue sending as we go ahead and answer these first few. I'll kick it off with a question I actually had on my own. I'm wondering, who in organizations do you typically find is the best person to drive an initiative like this? I know you mentioned it's going to be collaborative between maintenance and operations, but who is usually the point person running something like this?
So I think the point person has to be the maintenance manager. In my previous role, that was me, and I drove it. But it's really important that you get the next level up on board. And it's really important that you get your plant manager, your asset manager, or production manager, or whatever the next level up is, to understand what you're trying to do, that you're trying to do the right thing and make it sustainable. Now, that conversation can sometimes be difficult, and it can sometimes take a bit of time. But once you get that understanding and that buy-in at that level, that what you're trying to do is not something that's a one-off cut, but it's a sustainable reduction, and you have a good kind of cooperation with that level, you can really make a big difference. And it becomes then also for you as the maintenance manager a lot easier to message this throughout your organization and your team when you have that higher leadership support. That's really important.
Awesome. Great answer. There's a question in here from Shadrach. It says, what's the top reason that slows down organizations from achieving savings in the 4 categories that you outlined today?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. If I just look back, I think from my experience and what I hear from others is that it's the hurry to cut costs, right? Very, very often, people are very reactive when it comes to costs. The costs are blown out, the budget needs to be reduced. And so there's very little time to look at this more proactively. And this is where the tricky conversation comes in with the leadership and say, look, let's do this the right way. And take our time to do it. And one thing you can do, and I've done this myself in the past, is you say, okay, look, let's, for example, when it comes to productivity, you can say, okay, what we'll do is we'll take an initial cut in our external contractors, we'll implement an improved planning and scheduling process that will get us there. And then towards the end, we can see if we can make a further reduction. So that kind of gives you a balanced approach. So you agree to some upfront pain, but you also get the buy-in to do a sustainable approach. And then towards the end, you can see whether you can let go some. But I think for me, the biggest reason is just the fact that a lot of organizations are in that reactive space and don't have the time or the patience or the willingness to wait for sustainable change.
Awesome. Another question in here is, how do you compare your method to others out there in terms of simplicity? Maybe just, I'm not sure, Tyler, if you might have an example of another out there in terms of simplicity, but any thoughts on that, Eric?
Look, I always try to keep things simple. That's just easy to get done. But yeah, think about it. So for example, when it comes to preventive maintenance optimization or reviewing your PM program, right? I was speaking to a potential customer the other day, and they were in that space, and they kicked off an RCM program, engaged somebody, and they had gone through a very, through the proper process of doing criticality analysis and identifying functions, etc. They'd done a lot of effort, but actually had very little to gain from it because they'd spent so much time up front. And what I propose is actually, with a lot of these things, you reverse engineer it. You go and do your Pareto chart, see where your pain is. So identify the PMs or the systems where you have your problems and tackle those. And you don't need to do RCM. You can just do some basic fundamental reviews and say, okay, is that failure mode credible? Yes or no. Does it hurt us? Yes or no. Is the task we're doing effective? Yes or no. And you can quite quickly eliminate low hanging fruit, the easy wins. And that will get you a long way. And that applies same with, so for planning and scheduling. I think the simplicity comes from just using a proven framework. Don't try and reinvent it. Take a proven framework that's worked elsewhere and then just run with it.
Yeah, I think you'll always run into problems trying to do too much at once too. You'll never get everything done in one sweep. So breaking it down into simple kind of phases like you're talking about is definitely a good approach.
Yep.
We have one question that, sorry.
No, go ahead. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, one more question here from Felix. What do you do if the top management imposes on you the percentage that you have to cut off of your maintenance budget?
Yeah, that's very common, isn't it? You get a message from the next level up and you say you got to take 20 or 30% off the budget this year or forever. I think step one is to understand, okay, where does that requirement come from? What's that based on? What's the driver? So you understand where they're coming from and what that is based on. Then I think the next thing you need to do is actually need to understand what you think you can take out. Because that helps a lot. If you can go back to your management and say, okay, you've asked for 30%. Now I've looked very carefully at everything we do, and we can take, say, X% of preventive maintenance work out of the system. We can save so many external contractors by improving planning and scheduling our productivity. We can eliminate these bad actors. That takes this cost out of the way, and we think we can take 10% of our costs off. All in all, that comes to 18%. If you bring that back with a very clear presentation and case, I think a lot of leadership will say, okay, well, that's a good start. Let's start with that. Very often these things become difficult and heated because it never gets down to the level of detail and granularity and fact. And it stays at, well, you need to do 30%. Impossible. Well, too bad, you still need to do it. You want to get away from those kind of conversations and really build it up with fact. And yeah, in most cases, if you build a good story, you can go back to your top manager and say, yeah, I hear you've got 30%. I don't see the road there, but I can do 18%. So why don't we go for that to begin with? And then as we go, we'll see how far we can get. So an honest fact-based conversation is often, in my view, the best response to those kind of situations.
Awesome. I see a couple more questions coming in. We'll start with the one more from Joe here. It says these four principles are simple, straightforward, and not really new. So why haven't they taken off? Most reliability efforts do fail despite these kind of known solutions and known frameworks.
True, very true, Joe. Look, there's very little new in this space. Yeah, sure, there's a lot of technology developing, but if you look at most organizations that run industrial maintenance and reliability, they still all struggle, not all, but many struggle with a lot of the basic fundamentals. My view, and this is why I kind of developed Road to Reliability, I think there's a big gap in understanding and knowledge. Recently had a conversation with somebody who worked for a large chemical plant, had been there for 10 years, worked 6 years as a maintenance engineer and 4 years as a reliability engineer. And only in the last 2-3 months had he gone through some training on RCM principles and reliability. And it was eye-opening for him. But he'd been in a related job for 10 years. And that's not taking a swipe at the individual, that's taking a swipe at the organization, because we don't educate our people. We don't give them the tools and the knowledge to actually do these things. And I think when it comes to the budget, it's the same. What I'm saying here is really indeed nothing new. It's just about eliminating waste, but you need to have the tools to do that. And the organizations need to educate people. It happens so often that people get pushed into maintenance or go into maintenance and never get any training or development. Engineering is often not the case, right? So engineering disciplines, everybody has to have an engineering degree, etc. But you can't, or not, it's not easy to get a maintenance degree. There's very few opportunities out there. So I think as an industry, as a community of practice, we have a role to play to better educate our staff.
I love that. Another question here from Tyler is he says, how do you, after you have a mature and effective R2R, I'm assuming that's road to reliability, where would you go after then? Would you revisit what you've done?
Well, revisiting what you've done is always important. I think one of the key things you do is building continuous improvement loops. And that's how you get better and better. So with the road to reliability, I focus very much on productivity, a good preventive maintenance program, defect elimination, and then a good culture and leadership. Those are the basics. And then from there, you really need to see what drives value for your organization. Do you need to, is there, you run very advanced and complex equipment, and is there big value in going down the route of advanced condition-based predictive maintenance? Or are you better off to really look at your lubrication practices? Or it depends really on your organization. But get those practices in place, and you're actually in a space where you can take a bit of a step back and say, okay, well, where do we go next? And you may want to decide that you benchmark your performance against some of your peers and see where you are, or maybe look at other industries and then see how you can get better. It's a very great story about an oil and gas company in California. I won't name them, but they always thought they were fantastic in what they did, and they were relatively to their peers. Then they benchmarked themselves against Toyota, and they realized, oh, actually, we're not so good. So they went on a continuous improvement journey for 15, 20 years, and they ended up winning North American Manufacturing Excellence Awards as an oil and gas company, which was pretty unheard of in that space, because they just looked outside the industry to see, okay, what good or better practices can we adopt from others? But you've got to have the basics in place, because that gives you a solid foundation to work from.
Definitely. As Tyler said, right below his own question, simplicity and basics always win.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very true, Tyler.
Well, if there's any other questions, please send them through in the chat now. I think we've worked through everyone that we had so far. It's been an interesting conversation following an interesting presentation. So Eric, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you speaking to our community and sharing your knowledge with us. I'm not seeing any final questions, so I think we'll leave it there. Please be sure to look out for this recording for the slides and to connect with Eric on LinkedIn. He'll share his contact information with this presentation, as well as in Slack. So thank you once again for joining, and have a great rest of your day. Eric, we'll talk soon.
All right, thank you. Wonderful. Thanks everybody for attending.
Bye.